The day started like any other, with the usual chaos of a weekday morning. I was in the kitchen, juggling a half-burnt piece of toast and my son Ethan's lunchbox, when he dropped the bomb that would unravel everything I thought I knew about trust, truth, and the people who shape our kids' worlds. Ethan, my 8-year-old with a mop of chestnut curls and eyes that sparkled with too much mischief for one kid, looked up from his cereal and said, "Mom, Miss Carver called me a liar in front of the whole class." My heart stopped, the way it does when you know something's wrong but you're not ready to face it. Ethan's voice was small, not angry, but hurt, like someone had taken a pin to his balloon of confidence. I knelt beside him, ignoring the toast smoldering in the background, and asked him to tell me everything. He said he'd been talking about his dad, my husband, James, during a class discussion about jobs. Ethan had proudly declared that James worked at NASA, helping design rockets that could one day take people to Mars. Miss Carver, his third-grade teacher, had laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that Ethan imitated with painful precision. "That's quite a story, Ethan," she'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But let's stick to the truth, okay?" I felt a knot tighten in my chest, a mix of anger and disbelief. James did work at NASA, not as some flashy astronaut but as an engineer, one of those behind-the-scenes minds who made the impossible possible. Ethan wasn't lying. He was sharing a piece of his world, a piece of his dad, and this woman, this teacher who was supposed to nurture him, had shut him down like his truth didn't matter. I wanted to march to the school right then, to storm into Miss Carver's classroom and demand an apology. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Ethan looked at me, waiting to see what I'd do, or maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just about one moment. This was about Ethan's trust in himself, in his family, in the world that was supposed to believe him. I hugged him tight, promised we'd figure it out, and sent him off to catch the bus. But as the door closed behind him, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, lying in bed, my mind raced. I thought about Parents' Night, just a week away. It was a chance to meet Miss Carver, to see her face to face, to understand why she'd humiliated my son. But more than that, it was a chance to set things right. Not just for Ethan, but for every kid in that classroom who'd heard her dismiss his truth. I didn't know it then, but Parents' Night was going to be a reckoning, one that would expose secrets, shatter assumptions, and leave us all changed. Have you ever had a moment when someone doubted your truth, or your child's, and you had to decide whether to fight or let it go? How did you choose? Share your thoughts with us at Whisper Story. The week leading up to Parents' Night felt like wading through quicksand. Every morning, I watched Ethan pack his backpack with a little less bounce in his step. He didn't talk about Miss Carver again, but I could see it in the way he hesitated before answering questions at dinner, like he was double-checking his words to make sure they were true enough. It broke my heart, but it also lit a fire in me. I wasn't just going to confront Miss Carver, I was going to make her understand what she'd done. I started digging. I wanted to know who this teacher was, what made her think she could dismiss my son so easily. I talked to other parents, scrolled through the school's website, even checked Ms. Carver's public social media profiles. Her name was Ellen Carver, mid-40s, with a no-nonsense barb and a bio that boasted 20 years of teaching experience. She posted inspirational quotes about molding young minds and photos of her classroom, all bright colors and neatly organized desks. But there was something else, a pattern I couldn't quite pin down. Parents whispered about her. Some loved her strictness, others called her cold, too quick to judge. One mom, whose daughter had been in her class last year, told me Ellen had a chip on her shoulder about privileged families, whatever that meant. The word privileged stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. James and I weren't rich, not by a long shot. We'd scraped by for years, him working late nights at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, me freelancing as a graphic designer while raising Ethan. But we were comfortable now, living in a modest house in Pasadena, close enough to the lab that James could bike to work. Was that what Ellen saw when she looked at Ethan? A kid from a fancy family, spinning tall tales to impress his friends? The thought made my skin crawl, not because it was true, but because it was so far from who we were. Then came the first twist, the kind that makes your stomach drop. I was picking Ethan up from school when he mentioned something new. Miss Carver had started calling on him less in class. She says I need to think harder before I speak, he told me, his voice flat. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about one comment anymore. It was personal. Ellen Carver was singling out my son, punishing him for daring to speak his truth. I didn't know why, maybe it was her own biases, maybe something deeper, but I was done wondering. I needed a plan. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, sketching out my approach for Parents' Night. I'd be calm, professional, but direct. I'd ask Ellen why she'd called Ethan a liar, demand an apology, and make it clear she couldn't treat him, or any kid, like that again. James, ever the optimist, warned me to stay cool. She's just a teacher, Sarah, he said, his voice gentle. She probably didn't mean it the way it came out. But I wasn't so sure. Something about Ellen Carver felt off, like there was more to her judgment than a simple mistake. When have you felt judged, or seen your child judged, based on assumptions that weren't true? How did you handle it? Tell us your story at Whisper Story. Parents' Night was a blur of name tags, lukewarm coffee, and forced smiles. The school gym was packed with parents, all chatting about report cards and soccer games, but I was laser-focused. I wore my best blazer, the one that made me feel like I could take on the world, and rehearsed my talking points in my head. Stay calm. Be clear. Get answers. But the moment I stepped into Ms. Carver's classroom, everything I'd planned started to crumble. Ellen Carver was shorter than I'd expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to size me up the second I walked in. Her classroom was immaculate, every poster perfectly aligned, every desk in precise rows. It felt like a stage, not a place where kids could be themselves. She greeted me with a tight smile, her voice clipped. Mrs. Bennett, I assume? Ethan's mother. I nodded, forcing a smile back, but my skin prickled. There was something in her tone. Condescension, maybe, or something colder. I sat through her presentation, barely hearing her talk about curriculum and class projects. My eyes kept drifting to Ethan's desk, third row from the front, where he'd sat when she called him a liar. When the formal part ended, parents milled around, asking questions, but I waited. I wanted her alone. Finally, the room cleared, and I approached her desk. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. Miss Carver, I'd like to talk about something Ethan said happened in class. Her face didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. I told her about Ethan's story, how he'd shared that James worked at NASA, how she'd laughed and called him a liar. I expected her to backpedal, to apologize, maybe even blush with embarrassment. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and said nothing for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a slap. Mrs. Bennett, kids exaggerate. Ethan's a bright boy, but he's been disruptive. I'm sure you understand why I'd question a claim like that. Disruptive? My Ethan, who spent hours sketching rocket designs and begged to stay up late watching space documentaries. I felt the room tilt, my carefully planned script dissolving. Before I could respond, she added, besides, I've seen this before. Families like yours, well, sometimes kids feel pressure to impress. There it was again, privilege. The assumption that Ethan was some spoiled kid making things up to show off. I wanted to scream that she didn't know us, that she had no right to judge. But I didn't. I froze, my anger tangling with a sudden, sickening doubt. Was I missing something? Was Ethan struggling in ways I hadn't seen? That's when the second twist came, sharp and disorienting. As I stood there, grappling with her words, another parent lingered by the door. Mr. Delgado, whose daughter Sophia was in Ethan's class. He'd overheard everything, and his face was tight with something I couldn't read. He stepped forward, his voice low. Ellen, you might want to rethink how you handle this one." He didn't say more, but his eyes locked with mine, like he knew something I didn't. Then he left, leaving me with 1,000 questions and no answers. Driving home, my mind spun. Ellen's dismissal, Ethan's silence, Mr. Delgado's cryptic warning. It was all too much. I realized my plan had been naive. This wasn't about one conversation or one apology. Something bigger was at play, something tied to Ellen, to the school, maybe even to the way people like her saw people like us. I needed to dig deeper, to confront this head-on, no matter what it cost. When someone challenges your reality, it's easy to doubt yourself. Take a moment to trust your instincts. What's one step you can take to stand up for what you know is true? Share your thoughts at Whisper's Story. The next few days were a haze of determination and dread. I couldn't shake Mr. Delgado's words, so I tracked him down at the next PTA meeting. He was reluctant at first, sipping his coffee like he wished he hadn't said anything. But when I pressed, he sighed and told me the truth, or at least part of it. Ellen Carver had a history. Years ago, she'd been passed over for a promotion at a private school, one where connected families had pulled strings to get their way. She'd carried that resentment ever since, seeing privilege in every kid who didn't fit her mold of normal. Ethan, with his NASA dad and boundless imagination, was a target, not because of who he was, but because of what she assumed he represented. It wasn't just Ethan either. Sophia, Mr. Delgado's daughter, had been called dramatic for writing stories about her family's heritage. Other kids, mostly from families with jobs or backgrounds Ellen didn't understand, had been subtly pushed to the sidelines, their voices dimmed. It was discrimination, quiet but deliberate, rooted in her own baggage. I felt sick, not just for Ethan, but for every child she judged. This wasn't about one lie or one apology anymore. It was about justice. I decided to confront Ellen again, but this time, I wouldn't be alone. I rallied other parents. Mr. Delgado, a mom named Priya whose son had been labeled too loud, a dad named Marcus whose daughter was too quiet. We requested a meeting with the principal, Ms. Harper, and Ellen, framing it as a classroom concern. The day of the meeting, I felt like I was walking into battle. My blazer was back on, my notes were ready, but my heart raced with something new, purpose. The meeting room was stark, with flickering fluorescent lights and a table that felt too small for what was about to happen. Ellen sat across from us, her face unreadable, while Ms. Harper looked nervous, sensing the storm. I spoke first, laying out Ethan's story, then Sophia's, then the others. I didn't accuse. I let the pattern speak for itself. Ellen's eyes darted between us, her composure cracking. When I mentioned NASA, her lips twitched, like she wanted to laugh again. That's when I pulled out my ace, James's NASA ID, emailed to me that morning, complete with his title and department. I slid my phone across the table, the screen glowing with proof. Ellen stared at it, her face paling. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Ms. Harper cleared her throat, promising to investigate, but I wasn't done. I looked Ellen in the eye and said what I'd been holding back. You didn't just call my son a liar. You made him doubt himself. You made all these kids doubt themselves. That's not teaching. That's harm. The room was silent, the weight of truth settling like dust after an explosion. Then came the final twist, the one that left us all reeling. As we left the meeting, Ms. Harper pulled me aside. "Sarah," she said, her voice low, "there's something you should know. Ellen's been under review for months. This isn't the first time parents have complained." My stomach twisted. Why hadn't they acted sooner? Why had kids like Ethan paid the price for their delay? It wasn't just Ellen's bias, it was a system that let it fester. Have you ever uncovered a deeper truth that made you question the systems around you? How did it change your perspective? Tell us at Whisper's Story. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Ellen was put on leave, pending a full investigation. Ms. Harper apologized to Ethan personally, and a new teacher, Ms. Lynn, took over the class. She was young, warm, and made a point to ask Ethan about his rocket sketches, coaxing his spark back to life. I watched him start to trust again, his laughter filling the house like it used to. But I wasn't the same. Neither was our community. I started volunteering at the school, joining the diversity committee to push for training on bias and inclusion. Other parents joined me, and we became a force, not just for our kids, but for every child who'd ever been misjudged. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it felt like a start. I thought about privilege, not the kind Ellen assumed we had, but the kind that let me fight for Ethan when others couldn't. I thought about justice, and how it's not just about winning, but about building something better. One night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at me and said, "Mom, I'm glad you believed me." My throat tightened, and I hugged him close, knowing that belief, simple, stubborn belief, was the heart of everything. Parents' Night hadn't just been a confrontation. It had been a transformation for Ethan, for me, for all of us. As I turned off his light, I realized this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. A reminder that truth matters, that kids deserve to be heard, and that sometimes, the hardest fights are the ones that change us most. Believe in the power of your voice, and your child's. What's one way you can stand up for someone who's been doubted or dismissed? Let us know at Whisper's Story. If this story moved you, subscribe to Whisper's Story for more tales of heart, courage, and connection. Share your own experiences with us. We're listening.